I'm starting, even if you're not. We're doing investment in investment priority areas. We do have a quorum. And we are going to be addressed by none other than Andrew Duncan. This one here is the first of a couple of papers from Andrew. The second one is probably the more meaty one. Well, I could be wrong on that one. This is kind of like following through from things that have been before the planning area. Andrew, I've read this. You tell us all about
it. Kia ora koutou. The next two reports are related to Auckland's growth, how the council looks to support this growth with infrastructure, and how it's funded. So while our planning rules allow for housing and business development across the region, both in existing urban areas and greenfields, we cannot afford to provide new or upgraded infrastructure everywhere. A focused approach to growth infrastructure was first adopted by the council through the 2021 long-term plan and the associated 30-year infrastructure strategy. This introduced the idea of infrastructure priority areas, which Andrew will talk a bit about in the first paper, and those areas were identified as the Auckland housing program areas, where kāinga ora major landholders and investors, that's Mount Roskill, Mangere, Tamaki, and at that time Northcote, which is largely completed now. Drury, the inner northwest around Red Hills, Whenuapai and Westgate, and the city centre areas around the new CRL stations. So those four areas of focus were reconfirmed in the new long-term plan and 30-year infrastructure strategy you adopted earlier this year. So calling out a focused approach in our long-term plans was not just about CapEx prioritisation process, but also about providing clarity and certainty to the development community around the council group's investment intentions. And the first report that Andrew will talk to today looks to reinforce this certainty. Now, identifying and planning for the investment needed is only the first stage. The council needs to ensure that this can be funded and funded without imposing an unfair burden on other Aucklanders. There is general acknowledgement that our current funding tools are not perfect. The government has undertaken a program to review these tools, look at how existing ones can be improved and whether new tools might help. We are working with the government officials to provide input into this process. On our side, we continue to investigate options with the existing tools we have that could enable us to accelerate investment and to share the costs more fairly. We also look forward to the outcomes of the government work and then considering how the new or improved tools could support the council's work. In the meantime, our best tool for funding growth infrastructure remains development contributions. So just a few things around this tool. One, it still requires the council to finance that investment upfront. It is based on cost recovery and therefore needs a huge amount of detailed work, planning and costing infrastructure. And I just want to say thanks to all the people from across the council group that have helped get us to this point today of bringing this information to you for consultation. Development contributions do have some legislative limitations around their ability to recover the full growth share of costs. And importantly, development contributions can only recover the capital costs of infrastructure. This leaves the council to rely on other tools, primarily rates, to cover the new bus services, waste collections, maintenance of new assets, and other operating costs in these developed areas. And these can be quite hefty, particularly in greenfield areas where we've got new infrastructure that then needs to be depreciated as well, and we look to fund that depreciation. So the second paper that Andrew will speak to looks to update our contributions policy so that it reflects the council's full planned investment in infrastructure to support development and shares the cost of this more fairly. So I'll hand over to Andrew, thanks.
Thanks, Michael. So the longer term investment requirements in the investment priority areas, as Michael said, are set out now at a strategic level in the LTP and the infrastructure strategy. What we're asking you today is to endorse for consultation the specification of these investments at a more detailed level over transport, stormwater, parks and community infrastructure. The scale of investment we're looking at is substantial, and that reflects the scale of growth we're expecting in the city. So we've got 652 million, actually 801 million if you include Drury in the investment priority areas in the next decade, probably creeping up to 10 billion over the next 30 years. So in April 2023, the council endorsed looking out ahead 30 years of the investments required in Drury, and these were added to our contributions policy. We've now updated the work we did 18 months ago for the latest information and to include the council required stormwater investment in that area. We've also done detailed work on 4 of the other investment priority areas in the northwest at Whenuapai, Red Hills and Westgate, and within the urban area in Mangere, Mount Roskill and Tamaki. We've done detailed work on what will be required by the council in these areas. We've still got work to do on the city centre priority area around the CRL stations, and we'll do that next year, and a bit more stormwater work to do for Mangere and Mount Roskill, which we'll also do next year. Planning for the delivery of this infrastructure will give greater clarity around the council's intentions for investment, support better alignment of land use decisions, including the phasing of development, and integrating that planning, providing information to other network providers. So I'm happy to take any questions. I'd just note that in working with our teams across the organisation to develop these more detailed investment plans, we've built that from the council's service standards and from underlying business cases and work with NZTA. Well, what we're looking for today is endorsement on the consult on this alongside the contributions policy covered in the next report on this agenda. So this is an opportunity. We are looking to get feedback from the community through this process.
Thanks, Mayor. The question for me, and it's kind of on both, I guess, so I may need answers from both. But my concern, I guess, is just, and it's a question then, do you have concerns in the urban areas, the brownfields, that by doing this in some areas that it will just turn off the tap for development? So that's what we're going to get, I'm sure, feedback-wise. I understand the greenfield areas, it's all brand new and you're stretched out, but the brownfields, especially in that Tamaki, that's a big jump in Tamaki. How do we see this lining up and what effects it would have for development?
So there are major investments that have been identified for these areas on which feedback is sought. The level of contributions charges that flow from that reflect the costs of the infrastructure that development in those areas is causing us to need to make investment, and it will benefit those properties. Now, when we calculate the DCs for these investments, we do take into account what will benefit existing properties, and that's funded by rates. So DCs are only set, and in this case proposed to be set, feedback, based on what we consider these developments are causing the need for. Now, in terms of how that will affect development, we've had extensive research done by our internal economics team and by external experts. We don't expect this to flow through to house prices. They're driven by supply and demand in the broader housing market across all of Auckland. We might expect that there to be some impact on the pace of development in some of these areas, But we're looking over a 30-year period at this growth, at a 30-year time frame for the investments and the costs that council will have to invest in to deliver these services. And over that time period, yes, there may be some short-term impacts. We recognise that, and we recognised that when we looked at Drury as well, and this was the advice we received from our independent experts on it.
And just two
Just
questions.
to add, just to add to that, one of the reasons why the council initially chose those areas as the investment priority areas is because they're areas where we're working in partnership with the government and Kaingora particularly. So we have a partner there whose appetite for investment and development is strong. The other thing, yes, and jumping ahead to the next paper, the development contribution prices may go up significantly. In the scheme of development costs and costs of development, those are, I don't want to say minor, they're not the only impact on that cost. The decisions that a developer will make around the pace of their investment and their development will be made looking at a much wider total cost of development to them.
Okay, so we don't believe there's an effect of, say, Tamaki, which is really good connected, infrastructure connected to it, pushing development further, east or south away from here, like an adverse reaction to that.
So we would expect there'd be some impact on the pace of development in the areas with the increases, but that's our advice, our economic advice, is that will be a short-term effect. Plus we've got Kaingora who will be proceeding, and they've got a commitment to these areas and their partners, as Michael said. And we would expect over the long run, in the shorter term, there's an impact, and that the prices for land will adjust to reflect these costs over time, and then you would.
And on Tamaki, because it's such a big jump for the stormwater, how do we know, and I don't want to use the gold plating words, but we will get, that will come through the consultation. What is different about, and can it be explained why it's so dramatically different? Like, I'm sure the Mayor and others have concerns about lots of, how we get the figures for many of those projects, but this one is so glaringly different. Could someone explain? I know it's connected to both papers, but...
So I'll lead off. So the investments that the stormwater team, and they've gone through it with stormwater engineers, got internal and external advice. The investments that are include addressing the blue-green network and overland flow paths to manage major flood events, and that investment's planned within the first decade. But a lot of the area doesn't have a pipe network at all. It relies on soakage, and the other areas the network's at a lower standard. We recognise the substantial cost in bringing it up to a much better standard, but we also acknowledge in our documents the impact as your question indicates. And in our consultation materials, these issues are discussed, the officer's recommendations on the service standards identified, but we've also noted that you could have a lower service standard, would have a lower cost, but it's not going to be less than half, given that there's no network at all in some parts. And that then opens the debate up for feedback on the relative cost of a different level of service and the relative impact on the level of service you get for that, so that following feedback, the councillors can weigh up those choices and decide what they'd like to implement in this area. Is there anything you'd like to add, Andrew?
So I'd probably just so yes, there's existing areas of the Tamaki catchment don't have stormwater network. They rely on soakage, and for those areas we feel quite strongly that you need primary drainage system. Otherwise, the ground can't absorb as much water because it's all being paved over with more houses, essentially. Where in the areas of the catchment that have got stormwater pipes, they are currently, most of it has about a 2-year capacity.
Not even a 10.
No, well under. So essentially in Tamaki, if you get about 22 millimetres of rain today, in an hour, the drains will start overflowing. The network that is proposed for the DC policy would mean that there'd probably need to be about 44 millimetres of rain before the drains start overflowing. So that's sort of the level of service we're talking about and the upgrades. It's expensive because you're laying new pipes down existing carriageways and roads. The cost estimates include things like utility diversions, road reinstatement, traffic management, etc. So relaying that large length of pipeline in urban areas is very costly.
So that's why it's described like a greenfield situation almost.
In terms of the service standard, as I said, our documents open up the opportunity for people to provide us with feedback and for us to consider, informed by Andrew's further work, for you to consider, informed by Andrew's further work, the trade-off between the service standard and cost when we come to you for a final decision.
Okay, thank you. And this is all going to be consulted on anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's important to notice that whether we support these or don't support these, this has an effect on the value of the land rather than the value of the houses that are built there later on. So those that need more money spent will depress the value of the land. There might be some long-term landowners now who might not be too happy about that, but it is actually pointing out that some areas are less valuable because they attract more cost associated with doing some things than others. So that answers the stormwater things. I do want to question some of the transport ones later on, but we'll go on to Councillors Newman, Stewart, Bartley, and anyone else on the list. Fully with you? No? Okay. Newman, please.
Thank you, Your Worship, and good afternoon. And if you're looking for somebody to move this for consultation, I'm happy to do so. I've got a number of questions. The key investments that have been added to, you identify them there at 9 and then table 10. And I'm very, very supportive of the investment for Takanini's level crossing, but I'm interested to know how far behind you are in identifying the proposed parks and community facility assets that really have a growth component that need to be flowing through into this, particularly within brownfields. I'm very concerned that we haven't got enough of these growth projects scoped for this policy. I am assuming that we're going to have a refresh of this DC's policy every annual plan round.
Yes. Well, usually we'll do it every 3 years, but if there are key issues coming up through an annual budget process, we can certainly refresh it at that point. So our parks planning colleagues have planned the parks acquisition, development, and the community facilities delivery based on the council's policies for the delivery of these services. Some of the brownfields areas are reasonably well served, and some upgrades to existing facilities will assist in managing and continuing to be able to deliver the right level of service to these growing communities. In the greenfields areas, new parks will be required as there's nothing there at present, hence the larger investments required in those areas. So these investments only relate here to Mangere, Mount Roskill, Tamaki and the inner northwest, and what we've already discussed for Drury last year, as opposed to the broader across the city, because these are our investment priority areas at this point.
Yeah, which what I'm interested in is how quickly we can pivot to include those other areas beyond this, because, for example, I'm looking at Te Akarata in my ward, stage 2, the potential future facilities, which our parks and community facilities team are already identifying and are working out the timings of this for years 2 to 5 and then 5 to 10, which comes within the scope of a DC's policy now. And I've got $14.5 million worth of forecast capex in years 2 to 5, and a further 3.7 million in 5 to 10. Significantly, a lot of that needs to be apportioned to growth. So I'm wondering what's the mechanism for that, because it's not in the policy at the moment, and that I assume is because it hasn't yet got above the line at an officer level for this to be recommended for future capex. But if we don't start to charge it, that's just by one example. So what I'm interested in is how does one get that conversation to the point where we are triggering this? Because if we don't have it in the policy, we're not going to be able to accrue contributions for it.
So we'll turn to our parks specialist here for support. But what we're looking through, not this paper, but the next paper, is the DC policy being updated for the investment that is in the LTP. But I'll let.
Yeah, and I've just, so if these projects are in the LTP, then they'll be included in the DC policy. If they're added at a later date through an annual budget or LTP process, we'll put them in the DC policy. I'm not sure. I don't know the schedules of the policy off by heart. I've asked one of my colleagues if he can let us know whether they are, and when I get that answer, I'll pass that to you.
Talk about this next time. Thanks, Chair.
You okay with that? Righto. I've got Councillor Turner and Councillor Bartley.
I think it's moved on.
And I'm all right because my question is around the DC policy.
That's marvellous. I'm going to move this in here, and Daniel can second this. He sounded interested in it. And whilst I'm supportive of ensuring that growth does pay for growth, therefore we do need to look beyond 10 years into a 30-year period when charging development contributions. So while I'm supporting this going for consultation alongside the DC policy, I want an opportunity to look at these projects more closely as we get nearer to it. I've had a poke around the transport ones and I'm not entirely sure we've got those right. But the idea to have some sums in there at this stage is sensible. So I want to ensure that these projects are well scoped and do provide value for money. And so, but looking ahead 10 years is hard, looking ahead 30 years is even more difficult. And in fact, so you can retire, you gentlemen, and I'll see if anyone wants to add to the debate. The next one after this, of course, is the DCs, which is a fairly similar thing. So if you miss a debate here, you may well pick it up in the next one. Councillor Turner, did you want to say something about this?
Yeah, I just want to say
Please
right now
do.
that I, just so that I can say I've said it at a future date, I'm struggling to connect some of this stuff together when I see the things that are happening in Red Hills and stuff, and the future discussion of this money to grow, but we've got a backlog of problems which aren't funded by future money. So and you, Mr. Chair, just made the comment about wanting to look deeper into the individual projects. I think I understand what you're saying, and I certainly agree with it. I just wanted to make it clear that I'm struggling to put all the pieces together on this so that I can say it again in the future.
Well, you're not alone on that. This is kind of like a large-scale monetary policy, unless I've got that seriously wrong. And it will be made up of projects, but those projects may well not be the projects we foresee at the moment, and they may not be quite in that thing. I mean, we've also had discussion about Kaingaora being involved, but in fact, unless they dramatically change their way of thinking, they won't be. But then on the other hand, you've got Simplicity Living, which is doing exactly what Kaingaora was set up to do and is doing in the private sector. So somebody will be doing these things, and those areas which are chosen are logical areas to be seeing some of the growth in the future. But I've always found predictions very hard, especially about the future. So I think this is a prudent approach, is how I would suggest that. is anyone, if we're not happy, if we're okay, I'm going to actually put this to the vote. So all those in favour at this stage, please say aye. To the contrary.
Aye.
I hope there wasn't a rude noise, but I'll take it as a vote. And we'll welcome you, the same team back this time, because it's even more complicated. I'm going to suggest to Andrew that you get a bit close to the microphone, because when you're chatting to Richard Hills, it's not just a personal conversation. We like to hear it as well, if that's all right. So take us through this one here. These things are going to consultation. And one thing I can predict, that this consultation will produce some adverse responses. There are some people who have seriously invested in certain guesses to the future, which may turn out to be not right on their part, particularly people who have invested in large-scale chunks of land in the expectation of something or other. They may well find that they've paid too much for it, but that's not my fault or problem. So it is going to consultation. Just remember that. So we have to be sure that what we are producing is a policy which is valid for consultation, and we will have a discussion about its implementation in the fullness of time. But I have already scoped out that I want to poke around and just see that these are built on things which are viable and sensible. There's a lot of pages in the addenda. I've had a good crack at these myself. Some of them here are very heavy, and I've actually asked ahead of time that we might get some just scoping of examples in here. If you look at some of these pages in here, there are massive figures, and I poked around there. I couldn't be sure whether there aren't any mistakes in some of these ways on the pages. And 100, 200 to 217, there's a lot of information here. And it shows there's a lot of thought being put into this. It's not just being guessed. But it would be heroic to assume that every piece in here is dead right. But if you don't assemble off something to give yourself a gainful estimate of what's the future, you're going to be really wildly astray. Is that fair enough to say that? So, Andrew, just give us a good poke around on what your thinking is here as well, and how you've got to this, to give us a level of sort of comfort to go for consultation, which will further inform this debate. That's just what I'm putting in the background. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry about that speech, but this is a field that people who pay development contributions want to be absolutely sure they're not paying any more than they should have, and we on the other side want to make sure that we're covered enough so that we are protecting ratepayers from things which don't happen in the future. So it is bound to be contentious because the sums of money are very large.
Just before I hand you over to the irrepressible Andrew, just further to the comment by Councillor Turner earlier around how the pieces of the growth story fit together. We have taken your direction on that from the direction document from the Mayor and Councillors for the annual plan. And one of those pieces of work that you've specifically asked us for is a story that weaves those pieces together. So there are people working on that as we speak. So just to put you at ease there, hand you over to Andrew.
So this report's recommending you adopt a draft policy for consultation. And you all know what DCs are. I won't read that bit of my speech out. The key thing is, as the Mayor, as Your Worship said, is that you're getting a fair share of these costs between developers and ratepayers. So this is a new policy. It updates our current policy for decisions you've made on investment in the long-term plan, for changes to the expenditure for projects that were in the previous policy that have happened since 2021. Some amendments to our proposed investments in Drury, and of course the addition of the projects out 30 years to support the other investment priority areas that we've just talked about. Now, we've also already talked a bit about this being a major increase in the DC prices for developers. And we've responded to those questions. It goes through to land price, not house prices. There will be some short-term impacts on development in some areas, but we are looking out into the longer term. The documents you've got reflect us ensuring we're complying with the Local Government Act in terms of setting DCs. And the Mayor referred to our Schedule 8, which is quite long. And we have to produce this to be able to show that we are fairly sharing the costs between developers and landowners, and there's a good background for it. And that big long set of tables shows you what the project costs, how much we expect to get from DCs, how much from other sources, which for many transport projects will be some National Land Transport Fund money, as well as rates. And it also shows for the projects we've started years ago, how much of that we've already recovered. And we're required to do this to comply with the law. I mean, Michael talked earlier about discussing with government better tools. We've got DCs now, we use them. I might say they're probably pretty straightforward if you're adding a suburb onto a smaller town, but we're adding several smaller towns and a couple of cities to Auckland over the next 30 years. And given our scale, it is hugely complex. We put a very big effort into making sure we have got it as right as we can now. And that gives those who are interested in affected, if they want, an opportunity to really see what's driving the potential impacts on them. Now, this is a proposal for consultation. We've already had a bit of feedback, and we're allowing 7 weeks for consultation on this. We usually only have 4 weeks for most of our consultation, but given the complexity and the scale of the impacts, 7 weeks is an appropriate period of time. We'll come to you in December with the feedback that's been received, and then report to you in February with recommendations for a new policy to adopt that take effect in March. We've already had a bit of pre-engagement with the development community. So we had 4 sessions in last month, had over 100 people attend, and some of that initial feedback is an attachment to one of the reports, and it's referred to in our advice as well. The consultation we're planning will provide more opportunity for feedback from the development community, but also the wider public, and we've in particular made arrangements for some of that to be presented to you directly. So that will be there as well. And of course, all our staff will be available to discuss issues and questions with those wanting to make submissions. So happy to take any questions.
Righto, that's a preamble. There's a lot in this, and I hope you ploughed through it, you guys. I can understand if you didn't. It took me a while, and I speak this language. Councillor Newman, Councillor Bartley, and Councillor Hills, in that order, please.
Good afternoon, Andrew. Hello, Andrew. Hi. I've sent you an email, and Chair, if you want, I'm happy to second this one too for consultation. So I've, yeah, as I look, what I really want to know is that internal conversation, not just within parks and facilities this time, but also too with Auckland Transport. Because I still think that even now, there is growth-related capex that will be required, both within greenfields and in brownfields, which is not being picked up. And I assume it's not being picked up because the NZTA rates component of the cost is not identified because of a budget squeeze, which means that if we don't identify the transport costs, we're not charging for that, which is a real worry to me. So how does that conversation work within Auckland Transport so that between now and the next time we do this DC's policy, which will be in 12 months' time, we are picking that up.
I think going back to the first part of your question there, we have acknowledged that we can't invest in infrastructure everywhere that growth is going to happen in Auckland. That's a key piece of the council's response. The council has said we can't, and we can't build to the full potential growth in all parts of Auckland. In fact, in many places that wouldn't be appropriate because we don't know where you could end up oversupplying and get stranded assets. But this is why the council has taken a focused approach and has said we need to identify some key areas, and then those are the areas where the limited capacity we have to invest will be made, and that's what these areas are. So that does mean that there are some areas where we may feel that as growth happens, there will need to be infrastructure, but that may need to happen in more of a response manner rather than us proactively planning for growth right across the city in the long-term plan.
So when Auckland Transport and Council bowed to central government on the Auckland housing program, a significant proportion of the funding for the Auckland housing program was part of a reallocation away from projects that had been agreed to, albeit indicative, for growth that was occurring, not was proposed to be occur in the future. That growth continues, but because the policy doesn't provide for growth-related projects in those locations, the growth continues, but it's not offset. So if I use the example, in my Wood Hengai 2, which was quite about $12 million for road widening to connect through to West Franklin, the funding for that was cancelled in order to fund the Auckland housing program. So I'm concerned because, the Board of Auckland Transport has given the community about $2.5 million back, but there's still probably between $10 and $12 million of funding outstanding that we don't have, and we won't get it unless we can put it in the policy. So when can we do that? Because Auckland Transport has to do that. It's not a case of, we won't do it because the growth isn't going to come here. The growth has already been there and continues to be there and will accelerate there, and we can't not do something, but I don't have it in the policy. So how do we get that conversation going with the board and the senior management of Auckland Transport, because they'll have to do it anyway. It's just that I'd prefer that they did it at a price of 12 million rather than in many years' time have to spend 35 million. If you don't have an answer now and you want to think about that and come back to me, that's okay. But that goes to the nub of this policy, right? Because this identifies just a fraction of the issues, but we have preferred not to address some of these matters because it is inconvenient to do so. But the cost is being felt by the existing community, and that's what causes Aucklanders to lose confidence in change, because they don't see that we're responding to it by charging the growth component of that to the people who are going to trigger it.
So that is a real challenge with the way in which DCs work. So a real challenge with DCs is that the council can only charge, it's a cost recovery tool, the council can only charge a developer where the council has planned for the investment. And in a case where growth is happening, but we are not yet planning for that investment because either it's not a priority area or it's just we cannot currently work out how we can fund the non-growth portions, then people are getting off with lower DCs in some areas. This is a real challenge with the piece, and a piece that we are advocating continually to central government for, and one of the reasons why we would support something like an average DC. that allows revenue to be collected now from the early developers rather than them getting a free ride and later developers having to cover the cost when the pressures on the network have accumulated to a point where investment is needed. So we have acknowledged that there are many places where growth is happening, and the council is not planning for investment because we have limited capacity, and that means that the DCs are lower than the true cost that growth will over time impose on the council.
To be clear though, what we are also talking about is projects that we did plan for, but we have knowingly cancelled, but which need to happen, and they are growth related. We accept that they're just not going to be funded at the moment because we just have decided at some point previously not to do it.
We will look at the case that you've mentioned to follow that through. Thanks.
That's a very good question, and it raised some very good responses from you, Michael. I think some of the statements in there should be headline statements. When you do a consultation document, we're debating the correctness of the policy on which we're doing, but it's very important that the consultation document, the outlining information at the start, outlines sensibly and frames what the debate is about, what the debate is about. You said council can't build all the infrastructure for future growth on its own. That should be a headline statement. Then and that existing ratepayers are not shouldn't have to actually subsidise future growth investors. All those things, because this is where you balance between a large number of people who are invested in that industry who will complain about this, and potentially those are the developers, a larger community of people who, if we're not careful about this, will accidentally be funding it through their rates. The point you just made recently about the fact that some areas, because they're not included in future growth, will attract lower rates. The thing is, that's the secondary, the unexpected secondary impact position which councils and governments forget. And people like my former self, before I became a very sensible mayor, would read those things and see these idiots haven't thought about that. So we have to be very careful about the things that Councillor Newman has raised, because it's very hard for organisations to come up with rules and policies that clever people on the outside can't go around. And so what you do when you make a very valid, sensible, forthright policy like this is that you actually inadvertently drive growth into other areas where the margins are higher. So the average DC argument is worthwhile put footing and even should be possibly discussed in there, so that when we do get this consultation, it will not only inform us, but it will inform government. The government at the moment are driving a lot of this because they're wanting to have growth all over the bloody place in an unwise rush. And so we've got to be careful here. So I'm taking it a bit, but this is a field that I understand pretty well, and I know that's how difficult it is what you're doing. But this could go wrong so easily. And so outline at the start all those things that you and Councillor Newman have been discussing the last 5 minutes, because they were very, very important. If you didn't get those, doesn't matter. I hope I'll just explain it. Sorry about taking that little time, but it wasn't as much time as we lost on the Howick local board. So I'm going to go to Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you for this. I wanted to ask about Tamaki, because I am concerned at the big jump in the DC there from 32,000 to 119,000. And I'm just wondering, is there is there a way for a different approach with Tamaki, bearing in mind that, you know, there is no soakage there, so I'm not pushing for a lower level of service because it already floods, it's going to flood even more if it continues as it is. And I do believe developers should pay their fair share, but this to me seems very extreme. So I'm wondering, is there a different way to deal with this? Noting this is the first development to start off for the country, the social experiment of regeneration. And the government's already put in 540 million into horizontal infrastructure.
So we talked earlier, supported by our colleagues, about coming back to you, looking at some of the alternative service levels and the relative costs. So that'll be part of the advice we provide you after feedback. In terms of alternative approaches, our stormwater team is working very closely with Kāinga Ora, and if there are some ways that the service standard proposed here, or a slightly different one, can be delivered at lower cost by working with them and being able to do things earlier because of the amount of money they've got available to invest, then we'll do that. And that would then help development in the immediate areas of where those investments might take place, which might also be some of the Tamaki Redevelopment Company areas. So that's certainly something that the team is actively working on with Kāinga Ora. And if there were these changes, we would either adjust the DC policy now or in the future and engineer things so people were only paying the appropriate amount. Right? So that could be some help in that space. In the broader space of considering how the council might support some of the positive activities you're referring to that we're going to get outcomes from by the government's investment in that area, we could consider a lower DC or some greater level of council investment in those areas. That's always something the councillors can consider, but clearly the developers aren't paying and we have a certain level of cost to recover, and that comes from rates, but that's certainly a trade-off or an investment decision the councillors can consider. And there could be an element of that considered in response to the feedback we receive on DC policy when it goes out for consultation.
I think the key point here is, and Andrew's famous for saying it, when push comes to shove, there's only three people that can pay: developers, ratepayers or taxpayers. And these costs are required for the development to happen. This council has long had a position that growth should pay for growth. The government supports that and also agree that growth should pay for growth. And if we, in that case, in order for that to be the case, and obviously, as Andrew said, subject to any thoughts about service level choices and to the Mayor's comments about ensuring we're getting best value for money, once we've worked out how much the cost of supporting that development growth is, we need to sheet that home to the most appropriate place. And if the council were to choose to lower development contributions, that would mean that ratepayers would be subsidising developers. It's a choice we can make, but that's a clear position, is that in many ways the development contributions policy is just maths. It is the cost to provide the infrastructure for growth in an area divided by the projected number of new houses and businesses.
Could I just have clarification? You said only 3 people could pay, but before you said 4 people pay, you said the price of the land goes down.
Sorry, that's effectively the developer, the landowner, because the cost of development contributions or rates or targeted rates or government IFF levies or any new land tax to support growth paying for growth goes to the price, impacts on the price of land.
Yeah, but hang on, no. You said, you inferred before that the developer won't pay as much for the land that he's going to buy. So there's 4 potentials in this, not 3. And
sorry, yes. So there's the taxpayer, as in if we can find a way for the government to give us money. There's the general ratepayer, and then there is the developers and landowners who we kind of bundled together.
But effectively, when we say developer, it's the landowner who bears it. So if a developer owns land, then they'll bear the cost. If they come along to buy land off me to subsequently develop on, they'll pay me less. So they
I haven't seen it work yet, but thank you for the, prices haven't gone up, thank you.
I think I was next. Thanks, Mia. The question I have is on the back of what Councillor Bartley said. So I have asked this last time we went through this process when we got a lot of opposition to the changes. What is the rough percentage, and I know it's almost impossible, what is the rough percentage of what these DCs will pay for pre this change and post? So as far as I know, even those big ones in Drury only paid for a percentage, the rest did go on the ratepayer.
I'm just trying to flick to the right page in our document, which one of the documents has the funding sources for the investments. That's probably the consultation report. It talks about, so on page 7, it talks about I think this is investment in the LTP periods on page 7, and it looks at, for example, the $7.5 billion of transport investment, $3 billion from rates, $3.5 billion from Waka Kotahi, and $900 million from DCs. But that's for the investments within the first 10 years, and that's across the entire city, including the investment priority areas. And there's different mix for more of the reserves investments coming from. So that's page 7, and I think there's a similar table for each of the investment priority areas when you look at the total investment, or perhaps it's the beyond 234 investment, yes, in each of those areas. So if we don't plan for these investments now and include them in the policy, then by the time we could do so, we might have foregone, I don't know, somewhere between 400 and 600 million of revenue that would have to be made up. That's the maximum that would have to be made up from either not building things or higher rates or a combination thereof, because we can't go back and charge DCs to the original developers, and we can't charge future developers who might come along and after, say, 5 or 10 years, we can't charge them what we didn't charge the earlier developers.
So I guess, and it's hard to give percentages, but I can remember you giving me an answer a couple of years ago through the last time we did this. Like what sort of percentage of the infrastructure needed is coming from DCs now, and what is the plan? Like, is there a direction we're moving? It's 20%, we're trying to move to 50%. Because when I talk about the growth, going for growth that the government wants to do, I'm hearing that's like 200 or 300 million, 200 or 300,000 per dwelling on some of those, greenfield.
Yeah, some of those numbers are hard to run, whether they're including state highways, do they include rail stations, do they include some of the government's big investments. I think the key piece here is, by this proposal, looks to recover as much as we can, the most fair level of funding from growth. So there are some limitations that have us challenging to get right up to the full level that we think is correct due to some legislative issues. The growth developers do benefit from the NZTA contributions that reduce what they need to pay. But as a rule, the sooner we get projects into the policy, the sooner, the higher the closer we can get to the full growth paying for growth. And that directly goes to an issue raised by Councillor Newman earlier. If these projects are left out of the policy, and then when we eventually do need to do them, because we will need to do them, people will have not paid, and the ratepayer will be subsidising it.
And I guess the other thing, this is following the direction of the FDS, which we passed, but also to Ken's questions on places like Red Hills. That happened Red Hills happened because that wasn't our plan. We didn't want, so was another area we pushed back against. And this is one of the tools, apart from pushing back on plan changes, that we can do, right? Charging, yeah, because it's not a same formula for every area, I guess.
But each area depends on what we've committed to invest in, and to some extent, growth can occur in other places that we may not have planned to invest in, but by making the plans to invest, it also facilitates growth to an extent, and that helps that. But yes, we can't go back and charge the development that's already occurred.
Councillor Baker, please.
So just in regards, I was just trying to get my head around. So where a developer wants to build infrastructure, so community infrastructure, and instead of waiting for it to be built later on when we can afford it. And I'm just looking here, what capacity is it included within this policy for us to be able to negotiate with them in terms of the long-term lease, as opposed to us? I see within the development agreements part of it on about paragraph 97 in the draft that talks about council purchasing later on, that the DCs will be paid and then we go into a contract to purchase. Is there anything in here that allows us to basically work with developers where they hold on to the ownership, we don't purchase, all we do is become a tenant, so that we are not looking to just continually spend capex and putting communities into a 10 and 15 year waiting sort of pattern for that infrastructure?
So there's nothing in the policy that would preclude us from doing those sorts of arrangements, but it would depend on how those arrangements might be accounted for as to whether they might be treated like as debt, and therefore it starts to affect our other investment plans you want to make. But if developers are looking to provide some of the infrastructure, then I'm sure that my colleagues in the operating groups will also be looking to see what could be done in that space, because there can be benefits to growth to the developer, landowner, and also to ratepayers if we could find ways to do that are in everyone's best interest and within our overall budget constraints. So but we should be, and I'm pretty sure we are, open to those sorts of discussions. There's not necessarily always an easy answer, but we are and should be open.
So that interesting debate led me to the question, should we have a development contribution policy for private plan changes? So that we're not kind of caught out. And so those people can realise that that's not a free home run either.
I think that goes directly to the work that we are advocating for, and reason why we have advocated for something like an standardised development contribution across the region, because we can't pick where all the growth is happening. If someone comes through with a private plan change and gets passed and the council has not planned for any infrastructure, then we don't have a DC in place. The construct of the way DCs work, requiring us to have done, the extent of the detailed work here to plan out every piece of infrastructure, cost it up even into the future, decide what share of that is growth, what service level improvement, what's renewals, is really challenging. And then when new areas come on stream suddenly, such as like through a private plan change, we haven't done that work and they're avoided the DC. So this is one of the reasons why we think one option to look at, and that we've talked to the Crown about looking at, is would it be better to have at least a base level that's charged for all growth automatically, irrespective of where infrastructure is planned, just because we know that eventually infrastructure will be needed for that area.
So the key thing here that sits behind what Michael was saying is that your liability for development contributions is assessed not when you build or finish the house and sell it, but when you lodge your consent. So if you lodge your consent today, then a new policy comes in March next year, we can only assess you for development contributions on the policy that was in place today, and that's how the problem Michael identified manifests itself in terms of the impact on the council.
Well, given that, and this has been a worthwhile and quite intellectual debate compared to some of the questioning that we have had at other times, is it reasonable to consider that possibly an amendment adding a G that we ask you to develop that we include some thought as to how we at least go on consultation to develop a contributions policy for private plan changes?
It could just say investigate options for automatic development contributions for private plan changes.
That requires a law change. This doesn't require a law change. This requires us to have a policy, or at least indicate that we are consulting on the development of a policy for development contributions for private plan changes, because at the moment, that's an open door you could drive a truck through.
I think that would require a law change too, though, wouldn't it? Because we don't get to choose the timing.
No, not necessarily, because you only have to have had a system where you are developing, where you are planning for growth. And so we would be showing that we are planning for growth in unknown and as yet to be advised areas for private plan changes. It's pretty tricky, but our growth that we're planning now on the basis of these is not actually.
I think
I've stopped dead in the tracks there. I'm sure I'd get a seconder if I proposed an amendment to include that.
You can move it, you're the mover, but you'll just need to get, I don't know if Councillor Newman.
What do it look like?
Yeah. I'm not sure the Auditor General will allow the LTP to include assumptions.
I think at this stage, and given the legislative constraints we work under, consulting on a DC policy for private plan changes would be challenging. I don't think we can take legal advice, and I don't think we could do that. However,
I think you might be able to consult on it, but you may not be able to implement it.
Yeah, what I'm wondering is whether we can take that through the direction you've given us on growth for the annual plan, and we could take that this point as part of that piece of work that you've asked us to go away and work on already.
Well, I think the request there is just the inclusion of how we consult on the development on a thing like that there. And I mean, it may not be included in what you do next, but I want to record somehow or other that we're thinking about it. And I'd like the people in the industry to start understanding that we're thinking about it. And rather than flogging off a piece of bloody poo-hoy that they've bought now too expensively and rushing up the road, they'll realise is actually we might be sending a sheepdog ahead of them. As a mixed metaphor. Councillor Newman, I don't know where you are on this there, but I mean, I'm sure if you don't want...
I'm not with you, actually. My question on this point is this. So a development contributions policy is based on two principles: causation and who benefits from the investment. So I would assume that with a private plan change, it would be a combination of growth-related investment, and that there would be a proportion of that which would have to be betterment. And we, by virtue of the fact that it's a private plan change, we haven't assumed that there is going to be any ratepayer funding for it. Is that correct?
So it would depend on where the private plan change was and what the nature of investments. I won't give a specific. We have done some thinking recently about a private plan change that you recently considered, And the nature of the investments that the plan change would trigger were such that there was a big driver of cause from the development, a lot of benefit to the development, but also in terms of the law you need to consider when setting DCs, a chunk of benefit to existing properties as well, which would require rates funding, which we couldn't charge the developers.
So Your Worship, if you're going to continue with G, which I think is not very legally workable at the moment, can you ask someone else to second it? Because I'm not comfortable with that. If you don't mind, I'm just...
Councillors, can I just intervene here? I think, in simple terms, there's no problem with us doing policy work on private plan changes. There's no problem with, and there is already a linkage, a relevance to the development contributions policy. So, you know, that's already in there. I think you do have a problem with throwing in another dimension to this in terms of the consultation exercise for the development contribution. So my caution here is probably to ask us to do general work on the acceptance or not of private plan changes, that bit of policy, and kind of disconnect this a little bit from the DC's policy as it's going up for consultation now.
As the initiator of this, for very good reasons, I have been surrounded by multitudes of advice, and all from people who've never paid a development contribution, I might add. But I'm quite happy to not put forward G, but perhaps include a question of the chief executive and his staff to do some thinking about this for inclusion in the annual plan. And so because this is something that needs to be thought about, because every time, if we don't think about this, we lose every time. And we haven't. So you've done a good body of work with what we're going to do here, so I'm quite happy with the proposal as it stands, and Councillor Henderson-Newman's quite happy to second that still. But as a separate item, with your permission, I'm going to ask, and it would appear that most people will agree with me, that we get the Chief Executive to prepare some work to go through into the annual plan processes, of which there are quite a few meetings to come. It addresses what is a glaring lack of armament in our preparation for the sector. Is that right? On that basis, do you still want to purloin me with more questions, Baker and Newman?
I do. I have some questions.
Newman's done.
I have another question.
Bartley, and then we're going to vote.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted some more information around point 14 in the agenda, where it says that higher DCs do not generally lead to higher house prices. Just wanted some more information around that, because already, you know, I'm hearing from the major developer in my area that the cost will be borne by the homeowner. And the whole point of this Tamaki regeneration was affordable housing. Tamaki is 50% Pasifika, 23% Māori. Average income is around 19,000 in one of the parts of Point England in Tamaki. So it's not fair that could be passed on to potential homeowners when the whole point is to try and keep residents there, rather than the gentrification that has occurred when this project first started.
Well, you make a very good point there. So we've looked very carefully in the past, and will continue to be open to further information about this through the consultation process. The economists in the council's staff a few years ago looked at all the literature on how increasing these sorts of charges impacted on house prices, and found that they didn't across the empirical studies they looked at, except perhaps in a couple of areas where the price of land was similar for people as it was for agriculture. All the theoretical economics suggest that it will flow to land prices, and we've also had external economic analysis provided to support the decision on Drury that came to the same conclusions. Now, if we get additional information or different views expressed to us during the consultation process, we'll make sure that it's available to the councillors. But all our economic advice so far is that it's not going to flow through to house prices. It will impact on land values.
The key part of that is that the house prices, even though some of these development areas are significant developments for Auckland, the house sales in those areas are a small part of the wider market of houses in Auckland. And the driver of how much I could get for a development I put up in Tamaki, the key driver is comparatives with other house prices across the city. So what I can get for my new development, I can get as, something comparable with a similar house in a similar suburb. And then what I need to do is take the development contributions becomes part of my cost of doing that business. So therefore the cost goes to the developer, or if I haven't bought the land yet, I will expect to get that land cheaper because I'm going to need to pay the tax, which is the evidence that Andrew is talking about. But the key driver of house prices is the wider market for houses in the city.
And I think another point is that if developers could increase prices beyond what they're doing now, they would do so whether the DC was going up or not. They'd already be selling for the maximum they can.
Would you like to hear how a person who does this works that out? What you do is you look at that bit of land that you're going to develop and you think how many houses are going to get on there, what are the general price of houses in the area, what is the general cost of that house, coming off that, what's the margin you want coming down, what other costs, you've got the cost of the roads and all the other things you're going to put in that comes down of it. And then if the development contribution's 80 grand, you take that off it yourself, and then you end up with how much you left to buy the basic land. And the person selling the land will try and get you to pay a lot more. The person who loses, the person with the development contributions being high, is the vendor of the bare land. So the bare land owners are the ones who suffer the losses here of an increase in development contributions, not the person buying the house. Just because the development contributions might be more in Mangere than they are in Howick, you won't be allowed to charge more for the house in Mangere. It's the land gets cheaper. So I think we're all saying the same thing in 3 different languages. But which bears some resemblance to England. Now, Councillor Turner is going to provide wisdom and accuracy
I just have to back up Councillor Bartley, Mr Mayor, because I know you do this and I understand all the specialists that tell us this stuff, but it's not my observation over my whole lifetime. I've been getting told that supply and demand will bring the price of houses down all my life. And they're dearer than they've ever been. And you lift out the bit, Mr Mayor, about at the end of it, where the developer says, oh, it's taken me 2 years to get this all finished and the market's moved. Oh, we'll charge some more. So, the input costs onto any product deliver an end result to the market. So,
that's not true, unfortunately. I mean, the market shifts you up and down. I mean, on one particular subdivision, I might have sold the exact same pieces of land at 4 different prices, in much the same way as Air New Zealand sell the exact flight to Wellington on 4 different prices.
I will agree that the last thing we want is crap being tankered all around town. So we really have to try to get on top of why we're ahead of our infrastructure. And I'm listening.
That was entertaining and almost informative at times. We've now got to the end of this. If you want to step back and we might have some more debate, but we have having comment rather than questions as well. So is anyone feeling the burning necessity to have a comment? In which case, I'm going to move this. It was seconded by Councillor Newman. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone to the contrary? No, that's been carried. Now we have a couple of procedural ones, and Councillor Walker's not here to suddenly rush at these ones.
You're going to do both together. Oops.
I have been...
Wait. You're going to do 13 and 14 together?
Right, Sandra with an R is telling me we're going to do 13 and 14 together as one procedural one to be moved by Councillor Morrison and seconded by the Councillor Henderson. And all those in favour, please say aye. And to the contrary, you'll get shot. Okay. We're going to move to item number 15.